Hi everyone, I'm Danny Byrne from the Web Seller Circle, and I'd like to welcome you all to episode 4 of the Presenter series, where we're going to be talking in depth about different ways to add audio and video to your business and to be a presenter at live functions. This episode is about podcasting, how to be a podcaster, how to host your own radio show. As you know, if you've been following podcasting, the medium has grown quite rapidly and matured very much in just a few years. It's open to anyone. You don't even need a computer anymore to be a podcaster. The technical complexity that dogged the medium when it first started has by and large been conquered. Services like TalkShoe and Blogcast Radio work with a telephone. You don't need to know how to record audio on your computer, hook up a microphone, anything. You just need to know how to use your phone. All the technical aspects from recording to distributing, the RSS feeds, everything is taken care of for you by the podcasting service. That's really a great way to get your feet wet if you don't have much background in computers. However, if you have any knowledge of technical use of your computer, whether it's something as simple as blogging or building a website, all the way through audio and video, you can run your podcast yourself without the need of one of these services. It's not that there's anything wrong with TalkShoe or Blogcast Radio. It's just that if you have total control of the audio yourself, you have a lot more control over how it's used. You can edit the broadcasts, you can place them on your blog to build your own brand, to build your own audience, to build your own mailing list. You can use the blogs and the podcasts to get revenue from something like AdSense, where that revenue on TalkShoe would go, of course, to TalkShoe. So there's nothing at all wrong with using one of these blogging services, and if that's the way you want to go, I'd say go for it. Don't even hesitate if that's where you're comfortable. But if you're willing to take a chance, you may find that something like hosting your own podcast is better suited to building your business. And of course, aside from all the other flexibility, if you host your own podcast, you also have the ability to add video and to start doing video podcasts. So let's take a look at how that might work. The first thing you want to do is start with a plan. Don't just jump into podcasting. Don't wake up one morning, think I want to be a podcaster, sign up and start that afternoon. Of course you can do that, but you'll find after a few podcasts that there is an awful lot you hadn't thought of, and you'll be starting over from scratch. So especially if you're doing this podcasting as a part of your business, start with a plan. If you like to make lists, sit down with pencil and paper and write out an outline or a script or bullet points, whatever would help you think through all the different things you're going to need. Most of all, figure out what your goal is in podcasting, and not just what you'll get from being a podcaster, but what your audience will get. Because if your goal is, I want to do a podcast, that's very good for you, but that doesn't give me, as an audience, any reason to tune in. My goal isn't for you to be a famous podcaster. My goal as a podcaster is to entertain you. Your goal as a listener may be to learn, to just get a few laughs, to chat. It could be almost anything. But make sure when you're planning why you want a podcast that you're taking your listeners into consideration. Now, you're probably going to be doing this for some time. Hopefully you'll be successful enough that you'll want to be podcasting 2 or 3 years from now. And that means you're going to want a topic that you're passionate about. You don't want to talk about something that you lose interest in after 2 or 3 weeks, or that you exhaust the entire topic in just a matter of months. So take a little time and think about what it is that you can talk about, research, laugh, and cry about all day long. When you're podcasting, you shouldn't know whether it's work or whether it's play. It should be so interesting to you and hopefully to your viewers that you'll never get tired of doing it, that you'll look forward to podcasts not as work, but as a chance to talk about something that you really enjoy. Now, one more thing is that once you nail down what your podcast is, drill down deep into the details. Don't just say to yourself, for instance, I'm going to podcast about eBay. That's way too broad a topic. It may seem to you that it'll be easier to keep going if your topic is very broad, but in fact, most people find just the opposite. If they haven't defined their topic closely enough, they lose focus and it's hard to continue. So rather than saying that your topic is eBay or even selling on eBay, think about a niche, and a niche that both you and your audience will be interested in. For instance, instead of just selling on eBay, perhaps you sell some sort of art glass on eBay. And that would make it possible for you to have segments, regular segments in your podcast about, for instance, how to tell real from fake art glass, what a counterfeiter is likely to counterfeit, not a $10 vase, but perhaps a Chihuly, how to tell them apart, what's collectible, what's kitsch, why you love it, who your favorite artists are. By drilling down like this into your topic, you'll be able to set up regular segments that can become audience favorites. People may tune in every week or once a month, whatever, when you do these segments, just to hear you talk about how you can find a counterfeiter, or what the greatest find you had in your garage sailing was this month, what your biggest home run was on an item that you paid 50 cents for and sold for $4 or $400. Really drill down and look for something special and different in your topic. Once you've done that, you're ready to think about the format of your show. Now, there's lots of different ways you can podcast, but the first thing you have to decide is if you're a solo player who really likes to just jump off the cliff and get going, you'll be the person who's in charge of everything, soup to nuts. You're going to record, you're going to write the scripts, you're going to find the guests, you're going to interview the guests, you're going to edit the podcast, you're going to write the RSS feed, you're going to write the blog post, you're going to distribute the podcast, you're going to make sure iTunes is running the podcast. If you're a solo artist, you've got an awful lot to do. Maybe you'd be better off as part of a team. Even if you don't want to be the behind-the-scenes person, you want to be the person talking to the microphone, you might have a partner who'd prefer to edit. Or you might find that you work better sharing the interviewing tasks. You might work better just splitting the time on air. Give serious thought to whether or not it would be better to have partners working with you on your podcast, because you may find that the grind of doing it, even if you love to do it, doing it week after week after week by yourself can become really tiring. If you're part of a team, you give each other encouragement and you help each other keep going, and you have somebody else to turn to when you're frustrated, somebody to bounce ideas off. So first think, do you want to be a solo podcaster? Do you want to have somebody working with you? Then decide how long your podcasts are going to be. There's no real right answer to this. It can be 5 minutes, it can be 5 hours. The length of your podcast is determined, first of all, by how long you can talk, but second and more importantly, by how long your audience can listen. Your podcast should be just long enough to cover your topic. If you can do that in 15 minutes or less, I think you'll find that a lot of people will thank you. Remember, people listen to podcasts not necessarily sitting in front of their computer like they might watch a TV show, or in a long confined period like they listen to the radio in the car. People listen by downloading, putting them on an iPod, walking the dog, taking a stroll around the neighborhood, going to the gym. They don't necessarily want long, hard-to-follow podcasts. If your topic demands that, then that's what your topic demands. But if it doesn't, try to keep it short. The next thing you want to think of is how often you have to podcast. Again, there's no definite rule for this. You can do it once a day, once a week, every other week, once every month, every other month. There's not a real rule. Obviously, when you're getting into these longer periods like once a month, people are going to tend to forget that you've done these podcasts. So I would recommend that at the least you do it every other week. Once a week seems to be sort of the golden rule, but it's not an absolute requirement. And again, the question is what works for you and what works for your topic. The main thing is you want predictability. You don't want to do Monday one week, Wednesday the next week, Friday the next week, Friday the next week after that, then to Tuesday, then twice the next week. Keep it either once a week, same day a week, once every other week, same day. Even if it's not live, it's important to be predictable. The next thing to think about is location. This may seem to be a no-brainer. Obviously, you want to record in a quiet room. You don't want a lot of distractions. If possible, you don't want a lot of echoes. A room that's a good broadcasting booth usually has furniture, drapes, rugs, things like that. In fact, some people actually podcast from clothes closets because they're so good at deadening echoes. You don't probably want to use a kitchen or a bathroom or something like that. But the other thing to think about is whether or not you want to go live on location sometimes. It depends on your topic. But if you're doing a garage sale segment, it may be very interesting to take a recorder out with you, take your microphone, your recorder, and go live on location on the garage sale and interview people. You don't have to do this constantly, but as something to spice up the show, it certainly can add a lot of interest. It's a little harder to edit the sound, of course, but it's something to certainly keep in mind. So now you're almost ready to go. All these factors all work together. They all have to serve your goal in the podcast, which is the first thing you thought of, and they have to work for your audience. Assuming that's all in place, then what are you going to do next? Well, you're going to do what works best for you. And in that, you have to decide how these things fit for your topic and whether you want to do them live or if you want to edit the podcast. Again, there's no real rule. Either one will work. In my opinion, I personally prefer to listen to edited podcasts. It's harder to do an edited podcast than a live for most people because of the amount of preparation that goes into it and because you have to compress things very tightly. When it's live, you don't have the extra work usually that goes into post-production. An edited podcast usually takes 2 to 4 times as long as the air time to edit. That means if you have a 15-minute podcast, it could take you an hour or more just to edit it. And you don't necessarily have that post-production time live. So that's another thing to think about. Again, it depends on how many people are involved, how much work you want to put into these kind of things, and whether you enjoy something like editing. But if you do want to do a shorter podcast, you may find that the edited format works better for you. Also, when you edit them, because you're not doing it live, you have a lot more control over the audio levels, and frequently it seems like a much more professional production. So it's something to think about when you're working on your podcasts. So let's talk a little bit quickly about the equipment and software you need to produce your own podcast. Pretty much you see everything you'll need hardware-wise, right here in this picture, of course you're going to need a computer. It doesn't need to be a Mac as it is in this picture, but it needs to be something that can record sound, so it needs a sound card. You need a microphone. A good mic will be a USB mic. It'll plug into the USB jack on your computer, or it will plug into a high-end audio recorder. You're going to want a stand for that microphone. This mic is on a boom stand, and those are very convenient, and one of the best ways not to pick up vibrations from you moving around, bumping the desk, or squeaking your chair. A boom stand works, but a desk stand will work as well. If you look closely at this mic in the picture, you'll see that it's actually hung from a series of nylon wires in the microphone stand. That's called a spider mount. And what that does is prevent vibrations from being transferred to the microphone. So if you can get a stand with a spider mount, which is usually a second attachment, that's a great idea. Spider mount might cost you about $25. The mic stand will probably run you about $25. The microphone itself might run you $100 or more, depending on the kind you want to use. In front of the microphone in this picture, you'll see what's called a pop filter, P-O-P, pop. What those do is prevent those plosives, the P's and the B's, from popping as you speak directly into the microphone. If you have a problem with that, think about getting a pop filter. They usually cost under $20. That's all the hardware you actually need to produce a top quality podcast on your own. Now, software is also pretty basic. I would suggest that you get Skype and get a Skype Out subscription. That'll run you about $36 a year, $3 a month. That will allow you to make phone calls out to regular phones on Skype. If you have a partner joining you for the podcast and you talk to each other on Skype, you'll have digital-to-digital sound, which will be much clearer and much easier to work with than telephone sound recorded somehow through an audio box hooked to your telephone. So I would recommend Skype, and in addition to that, you might get Pamela, which is a recorder for Skype that'll record it in stereo. We have a demonstration up on the Web Seller Circle showing you how Pamela and Skype can be used to edit recordings so that each speaker is on their own track, makes it much easier to level the volume and to get out any extraneous places where you may speak over top of each other. Pamela's a one-time charge of about $25. It's actually charged in euros, so the fluctuation of the dollar can change the price of Pamela day to day, but it's usually between $25 and $30. The other piece of software you'll need is audio editing software. And whether you have a Mac or a PC, you'd have slightly different software. For a PC, you can get a program called Audacity. It's absolutely free, and it will do everything you need to do in terms of editing spoken word, that's podcasts, or even some music. It's a very full-featured audio program. It's a little bit complicated when you first use it, but I'm sure you'll be able to figure it out quickly. Again, we have tutorials about it in the Web Seller Circles library, so just look under Audacity. And if you have questions, please feel free to bring them into the forums. If you have a Mac, you're more likely to use a piece of software called GarageBand. Most Mac podcasters do use GarageBand. I don't have a Mac. I can't give you very good help with it, but I know that it's supposed to be very simple to use, and it's excellent for podcasting. Now, when you do your podcasting, I want to give you just a little bit of technical information here. I'm going to assume most of us would be podcasting voices. We won't be doing very much music, but if you, for some reason, do music, for instance, your podcast is about collectible rock and roll from the 60s, the 50s, the 80s, whatever. You want to play snippets of the various artists or the records and songs that they're known for. Then you're going to want to record at stereo 44 hertz. It'll be recorded at a bit rate of 96 kbps. You don't really have to worry too much about this, but your recording software will have these settings and you want to pick that one. That will give you near CD quality if you're using talk and music. If it's all talk, and by all talk I include a little intro and outro music to start and end your podcast, but the podcasting itself is just talk, then you can use a smaller, more compressed file. 22 hertz stereo with a compression of 22:1 will give you FM radio quality, and that's really excellent for voice. You don't need a whole lot more, and your MP3s will be smaller, which is a good thing in general. More compression that is still a good quality is better. There are a couple other things you're going to need to do if you're podcasting and on your own domain. You're going to have to first of all register that domain with a service like GoDaddy. If you already have a website and you want to use that name, your business name, whatever, that's fine. But if you haven't set that up and you want to associate your podcast with a particular name, go right ahead and register one. Then you're going to need a web hosting service. This may be the one you already have for your business, or you may want to get a second website. Again, you'll want to direct that domain to this web service. You're going to want to install a blog, not a website now, actually a blog. And why? Because you'll need an RSS feed to distribute your podcast, and that's much easier to achieve with a blog. You won't have to hand code it. When you get your website set up or your web hosting service, what you want is one with unlimited bandwidth. Now, a service like Bluehost or HostGator, they say they have unlimited bandwidth, but read the fine print, because unlimited is not always unlimited. If it turns out that you're an incredibly popular podcaster and the servers are really getting pounded and you're on a shared server, they will switch you to a more expensive program. You won't be on the $7.95 a month forever. So make sure you understand what unlimited means in your contract. It'll probably work for most people most of the time, but there is the possibility that you're going to need a more expensive sort of program than the $7.95 quote-unquote unlimited program that most of us use for our blogs. Amazon has a service called Amazon S3 that is also a good place for hosting your MP3 files. Not your website. This is separate. This is just storage for the MP3s themselves. There, another question, how much web space will it take to store your MP3s? The rule of thumb on that is the size of the MP3 times the number of people who download it, obviously. But it gets a little complicated because you have one MP3 that's, say, 10 megabytes downloaded by 100 people. Okay, you need 1,000 megs of transfer for that. But you're not going to have just one MP3. After you've been broadcasting for a while, you may have 30, 40, even 100 MP3s. And at any given time, any combination of them can be downloaded. So there's not a fixed formula that makes it easy to decide what you need. Once again, you want as much capacity as is within your budget when you start. Think that you're going to be successful, start big. Now, I said you need a blog, and by blog I mean WordPress. Yes, you can blog on Blogger, and you can put your MP3 there. Yes, you can even do it on TypePad or a website, but you're making extra work for yourself. In a few minutes, we're going to talk about a plugin for WordPress called Blubrry. If you are doing your own podcasting and you need an RSS feed and you need to upload to iTunes and need to know all the iTunes specifics, you're going to have trouble if your feed is not compliant. WordPress uses RSS2, which is absolutely crucial for iTunes. Blogger uses an Atom feed. That doesn't work, so you have to have a separate RSS feed. It can just be more trouble than it's worth. Don't reinvent the wheel. Don't fight your blogging service. Just get WordPress. You'll be glad you did. Now, I already mentioned that your RSS feed has to be RSS2. Don't worry about most of these terms. If you're on WordPress, that's what you have. If you go to Feedburner and you burn a feed for your podcast through Feedburner, it too will be RSS2. So everything will work correctly if you just follow the normal standard practices. It's when you get outside of the recommendations that you run into trouble. So don't try to reinvent the wheel. Don't think, well, I know everybody says to do it this way, but I like this other piece of software better, so I'm going to try it, because you just make it hard on yourself, and there's really no reason to anymore. When you've recorded your first MP3 and you're ready to start podcasting, essentially, you want to broadcast this now and distribute it. First of all, you need to follow the normal naming conventions of podcasts. That is, the podcast name dash episode.mp3. Notice there are no spaces in that name the way it's written here on the screen. You don't call it the name of the episode either, just by itself. You don't say garagesailing.mp3, which you might do if you were just putting it on your website. When you're podcasting, there are conventions, and again, you want to follow them. The podcast name is the name of the show itself. So if the Web Seller Circle had a podcast, we might call it Web Seller Circle, and then the episode would be episode 1. That's not a name for the episode, it's a number. .mp3. Web Seller Circle's a long name, so we actually might use the initials. We might call it WSC-1.mp3. You'll notice if you've ever done lists in Windows, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, when you look at it again, instead of being in order, it'll go 1, 11, 12, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's the way computers work. It's really annoying, but you can't make them do anything else. So if you're using the episode numbering, use leading zeros. Don't name it 1. Name it 001, 002, 003. That way your podcasts will be in order when you look at them in iTunes. They won't be going 1, 11, 12, through 19, 2, and then the 20s, 3, and then the 30s. It's really confusing when that happens, so use leading zeros. The other alternative is to use the podcast name, again, Web Seller Circle, dash, and the date. So that would be Web Seller Circle dash 12-1-09.mp3. Okay? Either way will help your viewers or your listeners know which one follows which. You're not trying to get placement on Google with these names. You're trying to make it easy for people to visit podcast directories, find the most recent one, and download it. Now, MP3s also have something called ID3 tags, and you want to add these to your MP3. There's a lot of tags, but at an absolute minimum, the ones you want to use are your podcaster name, the genre. The podcaster name would be you. Okay, I'm not sure I said that clearly. The name of the person doing the podcast. The genre, and then the name of the podcast itself and the website where you can find it. Here's what that looks like in Audacity. When you click Export to MP3, you'll see this screen, which will give you the ID3 tags. And this is just the way to fill it out. ID3 V1 for more compatible, because that's important. You want anybody to be able to add this to their MP3 player. And then the title, the artist is you. The album is the title of the podcast. The genre is always speech if it's a spoken podcast. You don't, your genre isn't rock and roll or big band. It's the spoken word. And the comments is where you put your website. So that would be how you'd fill in your ID3 info on Audacity. You also want to provide on your blog a direct download link so people don't have to go to a podcast directory to get it. Some people like to just download these and play them back on their computer at a convenient time while they're working around the house or something. It's not always going to be on an MP3 player, so give a direct download link. On the blog post, also include an outline of the topic, an episode summary, that would be the number of the episode, the date, the size of the file, a good descriptive title so people have some clue what they're listening to. Add in this blog post is a good place to put your keywords and tags so that people searching on Google can find it. And then if your podcast has links to other sites or software or something, add them as part of your blog post. Here's a typical blog post from Mobile Tech Roundup. Here's the Mobile Tech Roundup, episode 191, Black Friday edition. They have a little thing for you to retweet it. They tell you the episode number, how long it is, how big the file is, what format it's in. Here's the download link. Who are the hosts? What did they discuss? How can you get in touch with them? Click to subscribe by RSS, your podcatcher, or iTunes. That's a perfect outline for how you should set up your podcasts. If you do that, you can be sure that anyone will be able to know whether or not they want to listen, how to subscribe, and where to find you. Now, I've mentioned iTunes several times here. You are going to want to put your podcasts in several different podcast directories, but the big one is iTunes. iTunes is to podcasting as YouTube is to video. The estimates are that any given person gets 50 to 90% of their podcasts through the iTunes store. So by not using iTunes, you're just losing potentially half of your audience. Why this is important is not because iTunes is especially hard, but because they do have a few things known as iTunes specifics that you have to make sure are included in your podcasts. You want to make sure that you meet the iTunes criteria directly and exactly when you upload. iTunes has a FAQ at this location, or you can just go to the iTunes store, go to podcast, follow the links. It'll give you lots of information about how to set up your feed, how to set up your tags, what iTunes is looking for when they list you, what to expect when you upload your first podcast. It's a very good FAQ, and I'd recommend that you read it, but don't be overwhelmed by the technical details, because although they're going to have to be met, you aren't going to have to do it. Remember, I said that we're going to use WordPress because we want to use Blubrry. Blubrry PowerPress podcast plugin is what makes podcasting possible through WordPress, and it automates all of these technical things we've been talking about. It will fill in all the information that iTunes wants. It gives you a chance to validate your feed before you send it up. It sets up your RSS feed. It just saves you all of the work that you would normally have to do yourself. I'm going to show you how to do that in just a second. Here's one of the panels from Blubrry. So it's a little bit fuzzy, but you can see it has all of the iTunes information on a special tab, so you can make absolutely sure that your podcast feed will follow the iTunes specifics guidelines. So we're going in a second to look live at Feedburner, Blubrry, and iTunes. Okay, let's go first to Feedburner. Feedburner is now owned by Google. They used to be feedburner.com. They're now feedburner.google.com. I've already signed into my feed for my blog, Information Sells. Now, I don't have a podcast feed because I don't podcast on my blog. It's all written. But if you want to set up a feed, you just go to feedburner.google.com. If you have an account already, just say you want to add podcasts to your feed. If you're starting from scratch, it'll be in the first screen. If it's later, what you do is you go to your Optimize tab, you go halfway down to Podcast Feeds or Pretty Feeds, and look for SmartCast. Click on SmartCast, and you'll be able to fill in this information. Enclosures mean the MP3 file. You can change this from any rich media to audio only if you want to. It's not really necessary. You can just leave it at the default. You absolutely want to include the check mark for iTunes. These are the iTunes category and subcategory. It's very important to match these exactly and get as close to your category as humanly possible, and then to keep them the same for all across your different feeds and podcasts, okay? So say you were doing a podcast that was, you were teaching people how to use certain software. You might go to Education and then go to the subcategory Training. Look through them all and find the one that most closely matches you. E-commerce education is a training or business. Look in business and see if there's anything that matches what you're doing. And really there's not. There is no training in business. So you'd probably be better off under education and training. The key thing is to try to imagine where your listeners are going to look for you. You don't want to mislead people thinking this is a more popular category, because that's not going to do you any good. You want it to be where your listeners look. Then put in an image location here. That's the thing that's going to go out with your RSS feed, a little picture of your logo, for instance. The podcast subtitle, then the description, then the keywords for Google, and then your email address. Down here we see explicit material. This is important, especially for iTunes. Copyright, if you include one, your name, and then just click Activate. And that's all you have to do to burn a podcast feed. Notice down here that podcasting requires RSS2. That means that if, like me, you've been using Feedburner for compatibility across platforms and use Smart Feed, which is this second one here, I have that turned on. That will translate your feeds into RSS or Atom feeds. Atom doesn't work for podcasting, so Smart Feed won't work for it either. But that's not a big worry. Your main thing is to get your podcast feed burned correctly, and SmartCast will do that for you. When you have it, if you don't know what your feed is at this point, you've burned it and you can't imagine what it is, you can click on Edit Feed Details and it will show you the feed address from Feedburner right down here. And you can give people that. Now, I want to go over to my WordPress blog and show you this Blubrry plugin. I've already downloaded it and activated it on my blog to save a little time. The way you would do that on your blog is you would go to Plugins, Add New. You don't need to know the word Blubrry or how it's spelled. You would just go to Search, and you would search for Podcast, search Plugins. You'll notice the very first one is a plugin called Podcasting. Unfortunately, although this was a wonderful plugin, the developer hasn't kept up with it. He stopped supporting it about a year ago, and WordPress is about to be updated to version 2.9, and the developer has already announced that podcasting does not work with WordPress 2.9 and suggests that if you're using Podcaster right now, that you begin switching over to Blubrry immediately so that you're not caught in a period where you can't use it at all. Although podcasting is first and it has a great rep, ignore it. Don't get yourself painted into a corner at the very beginning of your podcasting career. Go to Blubrry, the second one, and just click install. That will download it and install it onto your blog. You can activate it, and once you do activate it, you'll see a new panel down here on your control panel called PowerPress. Just click on that, and that will give you all your Blubrry settings. Now, I have clicked audio option players and save changes, and that puts the players also on my control panel. Blubrry comes with 5 different kinds of audio players. They're all MP3 players. Each of these looks slightly different. I'm not going to click on them because they all play that when you click on them, but they all do the same thing. They just look a little different. So find the one that you like best, matches your theme or your blog, and pick that one. Then go into Settings. The Basic Settings tab, the first one, I would recommend that you click Normal. You can click Simple, but that really limits what you're going to be able to set up. Normal's pretty good. If you're familiar with all of this stuff and you really want to customize your feed, click Custom, but I'd recommend you wait for that a bit. The same with enabling advanced mode. It just gives you more to worry about. Then go to Services and Stats and read this. This will let you know how many people are downloading your podcast. Appearance is about your audio player again. And you can set how wide it is, how high it is, the time scale, little things like that. It's just about setting up your audio player. Again, I would recommend you just accept the defaults unless you're really familiar with customizing these things. Feeds will give you your podcast channel feeds. They've already set up a special podcast fee through Blubrry for me, and once I have things set up and want to make sure it's working, the validate link is right here so I can validate my feed. If there are any problems, I'll be told immediately. If you want to validate it by hand, you go to feedvalidator.org and enter this URL or whatever it would be for your podcast. Feed Validator will let you know whether or not everything is right with your feed. If you're not hand coding it and you haven't changed any of the defaults, you should validate immediately with no problem. You can decide how many episodes of your podcast you want to be shown in your feed. By default, Blubrry does 10. You can do more or less. That's up to you. You can also, as we did on Feedburner, upload an image that'll go out with your feed. So you can see all of this has been automated for you very easily. Here's the iTunes tab. Your iTunes subscription URL is where you send people in the iTunes store to subscribe to your podcast. You won't have that until you've uploaded a podcast, so don't worry about filling that in if this is your very first podcast. When you're ready to publish, you just click on the Publish to iTunes link. Here you can put in your iTunes keywords. Now remember I mentioned that iTunes FAQ. If you read it closely, you'll see they say don't use a lot of keywords. They think your keywords all belong in the title and the description. iTunes recommends that you only use 12 keywords, and that by and large they think your keywords should be common misspellings of words people may use to find your podcast. So like for web seller circle, we might use web seller with and without the S on sellers because it's hard to tell when it's spoken how it should be spelled. Things like that are how they recommend you use the keywords. Next, you're given the category and the subcategories in iTunes. Explicit is your choices in iTunes are no, yes, and clean. Generally speaking, you're probably going to want to set this to clean unless you actually have mature content. If it's clean, anybody can download your feed. iTunes image is what shows in the iTunes store for your podcast. So if you have a logo, this is where you would upload it to your site and iTunes will link to it. They don't host the image, you do. You bear all the bandwidth costs. iTunes is just a distributor. But this is where you would put the image and they'll be able to find it through this link. They recommend 600 by 600 pixels for your image. It used to be 3 by 3, but they're using higher resolution now. So take advantage of that and get a really nice image. They'll resize it for different uses in the iTunes store. Then this email is your email address. When you upload something to iTunes, they send you an email when they've accepted it, when they validate it and everything works. They send you an email and say it's now available. They'll be sending it to this address, so make sure you enter that correctly. That's all you have to do to set up Blubrry. I've done a pretend blog post, and I just want to show you how easy this is. We did a telephone podcast, a conference call on Web Seller Circle on smart goal setting. SMART's a system of goal setting, and Cindy and I did it. It was 18 minutes, and so we're calling it WSC1. WSC Web Seller Circle Podcast, Episode 1, 18 minutes and 22 seconds long, 17.5 millibyte MP3 file, host Cindy and Danny, topic, and here's a little description. I've added a RSS link and an iTunes link. All of this is pretty normal blog stuff. You'll notice, however, now that I have Blubrry, I have a new box down here underneath my normal edit box, and it gives me a chance to first put where I have this MP3 so that it can be added to the feed. So you put the exact address of where you're storing your MP3 files on the web. They don't necessarily have to be on your web host. This one is on Amazon S3. It might be on Bluehost. It could be on HostGator. Doesn't matter. When you put your URL there, click the Verify button. This doesn't mean that they know it's there, although they do, but they'll also check the bit rate and the compression and tell you if there's a problem with this MP3. If it verifies, that means it'll be good to upload to iTunes. If you know the size of the MP3, you can put it in, or you can put auto detect. I'd initially put auto detect here. After I verified, it filled in the size. Same with the duration. You can specify or use auto detect. Once you do all of that, you would publish your post. I'm not going to actually publish this because I'm not trying to distribute it, but we'll look at it as a preview. And you'll see on my website all the stuff we talked about. Now, I have the similar post plugin. I'd disable this if I were really doing this. But here's the MP3 player. Just add it immediately, and you can see here's the time elapsed, here's the total time. I can change the colors and things of this web player to match my website setup. I didn't have to do anything to embed this. It just went in automatically. Very easy to. So that's how you basically use Blubrry. We're almost out of time. Just let me show you real quickly one final thing, and that's the iTunes store. When you open iTunes, you want to go to the iTunes store, not to your podcasts themselves, but to the store, and then click on podcast. And again, if you're using Blubrry, you don't need to do this, but it does help to know where it is. Once you're in podcast, you just go to submit a podcast over here on the right-hand side, and you put the feed URL. Now, this isn't that location of the MP3 itself, remember. This is the feed. iTunes does not store your material. It just links to it by syndicating this feed to people who are subscribers. So you put your URL in there, you click continue. It'll walk you through it, and once again, just as it was on Blubrry, when your feed is accepted, you'll get an email telling you it's available. If you do this manually before you submit it, please go to feedvalidator.org and make sure that your feed validates. That's the most important thing, because if you submit a bad feed to iTunes, they'll just toss you off. So make sure your feed is validated. It's that simple. I know I went through a lot of stuff tonight. I want to thank you for your patience in listening to it all. But you'll see the technical parts are all now pretty much automated. You don't really need to know how to write an RSS feed or how to do some of this really complicated iTunes stuff, all you need to do is get a WordPress blog and install Blubrry, and they'll take care of it. iTunes is free. All of this stuff is free except the hardware. Podcasting software is free. The Blubrry is free. WordPress is free. The only thing you're going to have to pay for is web hosting, your domain name, your computer, and your microphone. But the syndication itself is completely free. And podcasts themselves tend to be free. If you're going to try and make money off the podcast, it'll be through advertising. It won't be through your subscribers. Again, I want to thank everyone for being so patient and listening. Before we hang up, are there any other questions at all? What's the best format? MP3. That's it. That's your choice. Very simple. Okay, well, I'd like to thank you all. This will be up on Web Seller Circle. If you have any questions or give it a try and run into some glitches, please write to us on the forums. If you give it a try and it works for you, please give us the feed on the forum so we can all subscribe and listen. Podcasting is a great way to build your authority, and also it's a lot of fun. So for the Web Seller Circle, for Cindy and myself, I'd like to thank you and invite you to tune in again next week, where we'll be talking in more depth about things like Audacity and how to get great audio. So thanks to everyone for coming in, and we'll see you next Tuesday.